In this episode of the Irish Skies Pod, we're going to examine the issue of QNH error and the potential for controlled flight into terrain. The sources referenced in this episode are listed below and are included in the comment section. I've especially got to thank Captain Alex Rattray of the UK CAA for his assistance in compiling this episode. In looking at the occurrences we're going to see, I ask you please not to use the words should, could or would, as in he should have, she could have, and worst of all, I would have. They're not what leads us to the actuality of the events. So let's see if we can recognise the patterns and try and stop the occurrences happening to ourselves inadvertently. And what we're going to look at to start off with is an occurrence on 23rd of May 2022. The call sign was Red Nose 4311. It was an A320 from Stockholm, Ireland to Paris, Charles de Gaulle. Captain in this instance is the pilot flying and the co-pilot is the pilot monitoring. Towards Paris, the crew is expecting landing on runway 27 right at Paris. The ILS on runway 27 right is out of service, and so they're planning an RMP approach with LNAV, VNAV minima to Paris, Charles de Gaulle, runway 27 right. This is the approach plate used on the morning by the flight crew. We got the intermediate fix, 5,000 feet, and then the final descent point at 14 miles from touchdown. Here we have the altitudes versus distance recommended heights, and here we have the decision altitude for this approach. The decision altitude we saw was 752 feet on the plate, but the company have a policy for RMP approaches with LNAV, VNAV minima, in that they add an extra 50 feet. So the decision altitude for the crew is going to be 802 feet. Again, just an explanation on RNAV and RNP. Source from Universal Avionics. So some things to remember. Again, source from the preliminary report into this occurrence, EASA's performance-based navigation guide, and the French Ministry of Transport operations for 2D and 3D approaches. As in aviation, a whole load of acronyms, and I'll leave a small version of these on the bottom corner. So RMP approaches with LNAV, VNAV minima are one type of GNSS approach. They're classified as an APV. And in the design of the APV BARP-VNAV approaches, the BARP-VNAV performance of the aircraft is taken into account when determining the obstacle clearance protection criteria. The APV BARP-VNAV approaches are not considered as precision approaches due to the performance of the BARP-VNAV function, and the obstacle clearance height for these kinds of approaches cannot be below 250 feet. For an RMP approach with LNAV VNAV minima, lateral guidance relies on the RNAV GNSS system, and it's mainly based on the GNSS positioning. Vertical guidance uses the BARP-VNAV function based on the aircraft barometric altitude. This type of approach, as for all approaches using the BARP-VNAV function, can be affected by altimeter setting errors. These errors cannot be detected by altitude versus distance cross-checks against the values provided on the approach chart. Vertical guidance satellite-based approaches such as RMP, LPV use vertical guidance based on the GNSS positioning and the GNSS augmentation system, and they are not sensitive to QNH errors. When ATC clears a flight for the approach, the clearance does not indicate the type of RMP approach that will be flown. So for example, will it be the LNAV, LNAV, VNAV or LPV approach? The acceptance firstly of an RMP approach, and secondly the choice between the available types of RMP approach, is determined by the flight crew's qualifications, the operator's approbation and the capability of the aircraft. In this event, the flight crew is not obliged to inform ATC of the specific type of RMP approach that they will conduct, and in this event under review, remember ILS runway 27 right was inoperative, ATC cleared the flight for an RMP approach. The aircraft was not equipped to perform RMP LPV approaches. The flight crew opted for an RMP approach with LNAV VNAV minima, and neither the flight crew or ATC realised that the approach and runway lights are off for the first approach. So approaching Paris that morning, the ATIS is picked up by the flight crew. Transition level 70, the wind was westerly at 10 knots, visibility 10 kilometres, cloud broken at 1500 feet, few CBs at 5,000 feet, temperature 19, dew point 14, the QNH 1001, 1001 hectopascal. There was information from both the tower and from the Met service that the visibility to the east of the field during passing showers was reduced. So at 11:32 and 24 seconds, the Paris Intermediate Controller calls red nose 4311 descend at 6,000 feet, 1011. The flight reads back 6,000 feet, 1011, and it repeats then the call sign. Again, shortly afterwards, the Paris Intermediate Controller instructs the aircraft to descend to 5,000 feet, again issuing QNH 1011, and clears the flight for the full RMP approach runway 27 right. Again, the red nose reads back to the descent clearance and also the QNH. Shortly after that, the Intermediate Controller calls another flight, EZ75 Mike Alpha, clears it direct to Papa Golf 650, descends to 5,000 feet, and again issues QNH 1011 hectopascal. The EZ reads back this clearance, but reads back the QNH, the 1001, which was the actual QNH, and also as transmitted on the ATIS. But this was not detected by the Paris Intermediate Controller. After that, in French, the Paris Intermediate Controller instructs an Air France flight to descend to 5,000 feet and issues the correct QNH 1001 in French. At this stage now, the red nose 4311 has reached the final descent point, 14.3 nautical miles from the threshold of runway 27 right, indicated airspeed 185 knots, config 2, and at that altitude indicated to the crew as 4,889 feet on the issued and selected but incorrect QNH 1011 hectopascal. The flight was actually at 4,623 feet on the correct QNH of 1001 hectopascal. We're going to look at a UK CAA video now, and it highlights the difficulties and the dangers associated with this kind of error, and it also looks at some of the mitigations that can be worked upon.
Welcome everybody to the 787 simulator. My colleague on the flight deck is Captain Ash Thomas, and my name's Alex Rattray. We're both flight ops and training inspectors at the UK CAA, and we're here today to talk about the threat of controlled flight into terrain on BARP-VNAV 3D approaches and on 2D approaches. Even though in a 787 simulator, I want to stress that this is a generic video because this threat applies right across all aircraft types, and we're going to talk about why that's such a threat and how it may be mitigated. So we're now on the final approach track for the RNP approach for runway 27 right at Paris. We're indicating 5,000 feet and we have 1011 hectopascals set. Now, it's always worth bearing in mind here that that is a setting that is incorrect, but for whatever reason it is incorrect. As we go down this approach, the baro altimeter will exactly match the expected altitude we should be getting at each distance check. So checking the baro against distance doesn't help guard against this threat. Another thing to be really careful about is the fact that the entire instrumentation looks extremely correct. So let's look, for example, at the flight mode annunciators. So in this case, we've got speed, final approach course, and glide path. Now that's what we'd expect to see. We've got what we think is the correct altimeter, and we've got altitudes that seem correct against distance.
So at this stage, the Paris Intermediate Controller instructs the red nose to contact the North Tower at Paris, Charles de Gaulle. The aircraft checks in and is issued with landing clearance, along with a wind check and telling them that they're number one for the approach. Again, neither the Paris North Controller or Assistant Controller is aware that the runway and approach lights are off at this stage. So red nose 4311 is descending through a radio altimeter, a rad-alt of 2,500 feet, and the rad-alt height values are now displayed on the primary flight displays.
The rad-alt is the only independent source of height above the ground that's going to help you discern if the baro information you've got is truly correct.
Radio altimeter.
Okay, so the rad-alt has come live now, 2,500 feet. However, it's showing just about 3,000 feet. And for the terrain we're in, approaching Paris, that is too early. So on this particular approach, 27 right at Paris, we're down below 2,000 radio now, and we're passing 2,600 feet baro. Now that doesn't seem right, but let's look how it draws us in. So flight mode annunciators look correct. The correct approach has been selected. It looks exactly on profile. And the what was the altitude at 6 miles there, Ash? Was that correct?
2360 showing on profile.
Right, so it was showing on profile. So we're now, everything's indicating that this approach is absolutely correct.
So if we take the grid that's showing altitude against distance, at the bottom we've got the distance to the threshold, 4 miles down to 0. Got the terrain mapped out here, and as we can see the runway is about 400 feet above mean sea level. We've got the decision altitude 802 feet, and what we've got, and the orange line is the altitude as displayed to the crew with the incorrect QNH of 1011 hectopascal set, and below it is what the altitude of the airplane actually is on the correct QNH of 1001 hectopascal. So we've got the aircraft position on finals now, just inside 4 miles and showing about 1600 feet. The gap between the displayed altitude and the actual altitude, 280 feet, which is 10 hectopascal. In returning to the UK CAA video again, we must remember that the flight crew reported remaining in cloud and turbulence until during the missed approach procedure.
For flying these approaches, one wouldn't routinely look at the radalt. However,
1000.
for good practice, it's good to incorporate the radalt because, as Ash and I will show you, any type of aircraft is going to fly into the ground on one of these approaches and it won't necessarily give you a pull-up warning.
So the approaches continue, and at 3.1 nautical miles from runway 27 right threshold, the indicated airspeed 139 knots, vertical speed is good. The aircraft is in full configuration for the approach. The altitude indicated to the crew is 1392 feet, but the actual is 1123 feet with a rad alt of 873 feet. But except for the gap between the two, this approach under normal circumstances would be considered as stabilized as per standard criteria. The aircraft approaches the decision altitude of 802 feet, but that's based on the correct QNH 1001 hectopascal. The altitude that's being displayed to the flight deck is 280 feet above that.
Okay, we're passing 1,000 feet Barrow now, but yeah, we've got 300 on the radio altimeter. That is definitely not right. However, if that radio altimeter isn't in your scan, you wouldn't notice it.
So as we continue on, at this stage now the ATC MSAW activates, and it activates as the aircraft is just 1.5 miles from touchdown, indicated altitude of 891 feet and a rad alt of 200 feet. The controller stated that the visibility and ceiling at the airport was sufficient not to implement LPV, but that locally in the east of the airport the visibility was poorer due to clouds and rainfall. The controllers in the tower could not see the aircraft in short final because of the bad weather. So a quick run through MSAW, it's minimum safe altitude warning. It's an ATC safety net that advises controllers when an aircraft descent rate is such that there's a risk of collision with terrain in the short term. At Paris, the MSAW is active, centred on Paris, 64 nautical miles by 64 nautical miles squared, and it's broken down into half-mile squares. Within each one of those, the main artificial obstructions and terrain are modelised. An obstacle clearance margin of 300 feet is then applied, and if the rate of descent of an aircraft is going to bring it inside that margin within 34 seconds, the MSAW is triggered. When it detects a terrain conflict, 2 warnings are generated. The first one is a visual one where MSAW flashes amber on all ATC screens, and an oral warning of beep beep alert relief or terrain alert activates as well. These warnings are visible and audible at all ATC positions. The procedures contained in the Paris Operations Manual in the case of an MSAW is that the controller in contact with the flight acknowledges the warning by clicking on it, immediately advises the flight that a terrain alert has been generated, instructs the crew to immediately check their flight level or altitude, and issues the QNH to the flight. And for an example, Air France 3245, terrain alert, check your altitude immediately, QNH 1012. So we're back on the grid, inside 1.5 miles from touchdown, and the controller then calls Red Nose 4311, I just had a ground proximity alert, are you okay? Do you see the runway? But at this time, the flight is reaching the decision altitude based upon the incorrect QNH. There's no visual reference and the aircraft decides to execute the go-around. This stage, the second ATC MSAR activates.
We're in visual conditions at the
50
moment,
above.
so we're 50 above decision altitude. We're in visual conditions.
Beside.
We've got
Too low.
4 reds,
Too low.
and that's 50 radio
Too low.
now.
Terrain.
The autopilot is disengaged and the captain applies pitch up inputs. The indicated altitude is 735 feet. The rad alt at this stage is now 52 feet. The captain moves the thrust levers into the toga detent, and this is the lowest point that was calculated, with an indicated altitude 679 feet and the radio altimeter recording at 6 feet above the ground. The aircraft climbs away in the go-around procedure and announces the go-around to ATC. So if we look here, the satellite picture, right here is the threshold to runway 27 right. And at this point here was the MSAR warning, rad alt at 200 feet. In here, the rad alt 122 feet. The controller asks, I've got a ground proximity alert, are you okay? Do you see the runway? In here, with a radio altitude of 52 feet, the captain applies pitch up inputs. The closest point of approach 6 feet, and the toga is applied. And here the crew announce to the controllers that they are in the go-around. At this stage, the controller in Paris Tower clears the flight to 5,000 feet and issues a QNH 1001, so issues the correct QNH. The crew, however, reads back, climbing to 5,000 feet, and reads back the QNH that they have had set all the way through of 1011 hectopascal. So I'm just going to rerun the video with the flight down approaching 50 feet and below.
We're in visual conditions at the
50
moment,
above.
so we're 50 above decision altitude. We're in visual conditions.
Beside.
We've got
Too low.
4
Terrain.
reds,
Too low.
and
Terrain.
that's 50 radio
Too low.
now.
Terrain.
So the takeaway from that is there was absolutely no pull-up warning, and that's not peculiar to this aircraft. That's the problem right across aeroplanes at the moment, and that's the thing we need to guard against.
So as we've seen, the aircraft went into the go-around procedure, was instructed by the tower controller to climb to 5,000 feet on QNH 1001 hectopascal. The aircraft read it back 5,000 feet, but it continued to fly with 1011 hectopascal. And again, this incorrect readback was not detected by the tower controller. And therefore, the flight continued with a selected QNH 1011 hectopascal and approximately 280 feet below what was actually indicated on the altimeter. So on the second approach, again, it's very similar to the first starting off. We're inside 4 miles from touchdown, indicating just about 1,600 feet. At this stage of the approach, the ATC MSAR activates and the tower calls Red Nose 4311. I just got a terrain alert. Are you okay? And at this stage, the Red Nose has reports establish on path, and we have visual now. The captain applies a nose up input, disconnects the autopilot. The crew recalls the PAPIs as being 1 white, 1 pink, and 2 reds, maybe 3 reds, but not 4. At this stage, the captain switches off the flight directors, and the Red Nose 4311 continues and lands with no further events. That's one that made the headlines. Again, a number of these occur all around the place, and one Western European airport has noticed a particular issue. About 30% of the traffic at the airport is North American business jets, but the unit is reporting a disproportionately high number of level bus, especially during the approach phase. Obviously, approach phase level bus carry a higher risk of controlled flight into terrain. So what we got here is level bus rate per 100,000 flight hours, and compared across 3 airports at this country. Time frame covered 2013 to Q2 of 2022. Airport A is similar to Airport C with a similar number of movements. Airport B is a very busy and large international airport, and Airport C here we can see is reporting way more level bus than what the other 2 are. So in 2018, North American BizJets were 27% of all the movements at this airport. 2019, they were 28%. 2020 and 21 together, 28%. And up to October of 2022, they were 30% of all movements. However, they constituted 67% of all level bus in 2018, 50% of them in 2019, 45% in 2020 and 21, and 100% of the reported level bus in 2022. So the unit queried, why has this been happening, and especially with our two North American BizJets? So some of the answers they were looking at and they've come up with is that selecting QNH as inches instead of hectopascal. So 29.88 inches instead of 0988 hectopascal. 2988 inches equals 1012 hectopascal. It's a 24 hectopascal difference. 28 feet per unit gives us a difference of 672 feet. In the preceding event that we just looked at, the altitude difference was 280 feet, so you can see here that it can happen even larger. Perhaps as well the different transition altitude has a role to play. It's 18,000 feet in the US, 5,000 feet at Airport C, and there could be a late or possibly even no changeover from flying on standard to flying on the QNH. Could be pilot fatigue and or increased workload after a transatlantic crossing. There could be unfamiliarity with the airspace if the crew are not often flying across the Atlantic. There could be a lack of focus due to forward planning, and this because a lot of these flights are just quick fuel stops, land, turn around, and onwards to another destination. And there's a potential expectation to switch to a visual approach from the ILS approach. An event that they looked at, April 2019, North American BizJet came within 2 miles and 500 feet of high ground while attempting to establish on approach runway 24. When cleared to 3,000 feet on QNH 0988 hectopascal, the aircraft descended to 2,300 feet. So the orange dotted line is the final approach track. Here we've got the intermediate fix. Here we've got the final approach fix, and we've got the aircraft just intercepting the final approach track. At the intermediate fix, showing here the downlinked cleared altitude is selected by the crew, 3,000 feet, which is correct. The cleared altitude is input into the system by ATC, 3,000 feet. But the actual altitude is calculated, so mode C, transmission, adapted by the ATC system with reference to the current QNH of 0988 hectopascal, puts the aircraft at 2,300 feet. And just back here, that he's just passed over, we've got high ground at almost 1,800 feet. So the likely causes were figured to be a failure to switch to the local QNH. So perhaps did not switch from standard to the 0988 hectopascal. That could give you a difference of 25 hectopascal. In this case, they calculated at 30 feet per unit. That would give a difference of 750 feet. Or they could have set the 0988 hectopascal as 2988 inches instead, giving you a difference of 24, and again using 30 feet, that gives you a difference of 720 feet from the cleared 3,000 feet. So QNH sources, and the METREP in a system I'm familiar with, it's input locally by the Met Observer. The METAR is transmitted from Met HQ and goes directly into the ATC system. If the QNH from one METAR to another is different by more than 3 hectopascal, a system warning message will show and a manual confirmation will be required. A plus or minus 3 hectopascal change can occur, usually associated with very, very bad weather. The METAR feeds the digital ADAS, and the operator of the ADAS is required to cross-check the METAR, the METREP, and the ADAS for any discrepancy. And then finally, there's a confirmation required before the new ADAS replaces the old one and transmits. Controllers were asked to be aware of aircraft registration and origin, just be very wary of the North American BizJets. In issuing the QNH, beware low pressure equals high risk, as we just saw. Use the 4 digits even when below 1,000 hectopascal and emphasize the word hectopascal. So 0988 hectopascal. Ensure the readback contains the correct 4 digits and in the right order, and ensure the readback contains the word hectopascal. Beware of early changes to QNH or possibly no change at all. And the unit was examining as well if the selected QNH of the altimeter could be downlinked via the mode S, like what we saw with the downlinked selected altitude. They look to spread the word among the BizJet community, and they've got a level bus working group up and running. The final event we're going to look at occurs up in northwestern Europe, and it involves a SAB 340 and a Beech 200 on approach. So some background to the event. In ATC, the approach and air drone control is non-radar environment. ATC has no electronic way of checking the tracks of the aircraft, and there's no electronic way of checking the altitudes of the aircraft. The altitudes reference were obtained by the overseeing ATC centre after the event. In the flight history, the Saab 34 is number 3 of 4 in sequence and its domestic and local operator, and the Beech 200 is number 4 of 4 in sequence and is a foreign military operator. The approach is to runway 18, it's a localizer DME and NDB approach, and the weather 200 degrees at 19 knots, 6,000 metres in light rain and drizzle. The cloud is few at 500 feet, scattered 900 feet, broken 1,100 feet. Temperature and dew point both 10 degrees Celsius, and the QNH is 0990 hectopascal. So the Saab 34 calls ATC maintaining flight level 100, 46 miles from the adjacent VOR DME, and is instructed to route to the NDB to hold an expected approach time of 11:40 is issued, and the aircraft is descended to flight level 85. Shortly afterwards, the Beech 20 calls in, passing flight level 130 for flight level 110, and ATC instructs the Beech to route also to the NDB to hold with an expected approach time of 11:50 issued. And that's acknowledged by Roger at 11,000. At 11:30 and 10 seconds, the ATC calls Saab 34, descend to altitude 3,000 feet, QNH 990 hectopascal. This is correctly read back by the Saab, and the Saab reports leaving flight level 85. ATC then calls Beech 20 when ready, descend to flight level 85, and the Beech reads back Beech 20 out of 110 for 85. At 11:31 and for about 3 minutes, the ATC handover occurs from one controller to the other, and they discuss the traffic pattern and speed controls. The second controller then assumes responsibility and calls Saab 34, you're cleared for the localizer NDB procedure, runway 18 from the NDB, not below 3,000 until advised, because there is traffic on the approach to us being cleared down to 2,000. ATC then confirms that the Saab has passed 4,000 feet, and it clears the Beech 20. Beech 20 descend to altitude 4,000 feet on the QNH 990 hectopascal. And the Beech 20 reads back, Roger, down to 4,990 for Beech 20. The Saab 34 reports the NDB outbound maintaining 3,000 feet, and ATC requests the Saab to report localizer established. At this stage, the radar rerun, which was done after the event, shows the Beech carrying out a parallel entry into the NDB hold from the south, tracking north, descending through flight level 80, and then the Beech turns left at 5.5 miles north of the NDB, rolling out on the southerly heading track 1 minute later. 11:38 and 30 seconds, ATC requested a level check from the Beech 20, who reports Roger 7,200. ATC asks Beech 20 report passing altitude 6,000. 2 minutes later at 11:40 and 30 seconds, the Beech 20 reports passing 6,000 feet. A minute and a half later at 11:42, ATC advises the Saab that you're now number 1 for landing, was cleared to continue descent, report leaving 3,000 feet and to report localizer established. And the Saab reports localizer established 11 nautical miles from touchdown and descending to 2,000 feet. So again, I reiterate, there's no radar service at this airport. The altitudes are based on the mode Charlie, so that's 1013 hectopascal, extracted from the ATC centre and adjusted here to the local QNH of 0990 hectopascal. So ATC calls the Beech 20, descend to altitude 3,000 feet on the QNH 990 hectopascal and report your position in the procedure, in the hold I should say. Beech 20 responds descending through 4,000 for 3,000 and returning back to the NDB currently. ATC Beech 20, there's one aircraft ahead on the localizer, approximately 10 miles at this time. On passing overhead the NDB, overhead the airfield, you're clear to commence the alternate procedure, and that's the extended holding pattern procedure from the NDB, but not below 3,000 feet until advised. The Beech responds, Roger, we'll extend our holding pattern. On a rerun of the event afterwards, the Beech 20 is observed making a left turn from the NDB, and instead of following the extended holding procedure, which was to make a right turn and extend outwards to delay behind the number 1. Again, 11:43 and 15 seconds. The Beech is now passing an actual altitude of 3,300 feet. The Saab is inbound at 2,000 feet. And ATC clears the Saab to land on runway 18. The Saab reads back to clearance. And then the Saab says, ATC confirmed the cleared altitude of the number 2 aircraft. At this stage, the Saab is 2,000 feet and the Beech is descending out at 2,500 feet. ATC responds, Beach 20, you may descend to altitude 3,000 feet, but to continue not below 3,000 feet until advised. Beach reads back, Roger, we are leveling at 3,000. Shortly afterwards, ATC asked the Beach 20 if they're familiar with the procedure for extending the hold and patterning and then turning onto the localizer. And the Beach says, yes sir, I'm completely, we're fighting this wind right now, we're trying to get back over on that side. At this stage, the SAB commences a descent from 2,000 feet, 7 miles north of the airport. The Beach was in the SAB's 11 o'clock at about 4.7 miles, converging from the left at altitude 2,379 feet, but reporting level at 3,000 feet. The SAB calls, can we just double check that aircraft's altitude? We've got him as, yeah, he's about 4 miles, about 800 above. ATC to the SAB, that's level at 3,000 feet for the Beach 20, SAB 340. ATC to the Beach just confirmed that you're level at altitude 3,000 feet in the QNH 990 hectopascal. The Beach responds, yes sir, level 3,000, 2990. And ATC responds, Roger. This stage, as we can see, the SAB is at 1,400 feet and the Beach is at 2,400 feet above. SAB is descended to maintain that altitude at just below 1,400 feet, with the Beach in the SAB's 11 o'clock, range 2.3 miles and an altitude of 2,379 feet, but reporting level at 3,000 feet. The SAB reports 4 miles from touchdown, and ATC again clears the SAB to land. The Beach passes the SAB's 12 o'clock, left to right, range just over half a mile, 0.7 nautical miles, with the Beach at just below 2,400 feet and the SAB just below 1,400 feet. The closest point of approach horizontally was 0.4 miles with 1,000 feet established. 11:47, the Beach requests when permission to turn back and descend to 2,000 feet will be given, and ATC instructs the Beach to turn inbound, establish localizer, and the further descent would follow in approximately 30 seconds. The SAB then calls, and Beach 20, check your QNH 990. ATC says, Beach 20, that's a firm, 990 hectopascals or 990 millibars, that's what it used to be. And the SAB responds, yeah, that's what we thought, thanks. So on the barometric pressure setting of 29.90 inches, it's the equivalent of 1013 hectopascal, which is a difference of 620 feet to 0990 hectopascal. The UK AIRPROX board established that the Beach had been operating on 29.90 inches instead of operating on 0990 hectopascal. The excellent situational awareness of the SAB 34, as he reported that on the TCAS display, they could see that the Beach 12 miles away and following in the procedure had not leveled off 1,000 feet above, but it kept on descending. On heading 190 at 160 knots, level at 2,000 feet and flying in cloud and IMC, they were now opposite direction with the distance between them quickly reducing. The SAB asked ATC to confirm the Beach has cleared altitude, and ATC replied 3,000 feet before asking the Beach 20 to confirm their altitude. The Beach confirmed that they were at 3,000 feet, however the SAB's TCAS showed the Beach as only 300 feet above. But now separation was about 4 miles and reducing, so the SAB decided to leave 2,000 feet early to ensure more vertical separation. This descent was initiated about 1 mile early, and having local knowledge of flying in and out of this airport, he knew the terrain separation would be alright, with terrain up to 800 feet to the side, but only a few hundred feet elevation between the SAB and the airport ahead. It so happened that there was an opening in the clouds just as the Beach passed over the SAB 34. They saw it for just a few seconds, but judged the separation visually as 1,000 feet above, with the SAB passing in 1,300 feet. One mitigation against the QNH error is the Barometric Pressure Setting Advisory tool. It was developed by NATS in the UK to identify significant QNH errors. The significant difference is greater than 6 hectopascal in this instance. It's based upon downlink mode S of barometric pressure setting, and it provides an advisory warning to the London TMA approach controllers. It applies only to arriving aircraft at or below the transition altitude, and it's limited to Heathrow, Gatwick, London City, Stansted, Northolt, Biggin Hill and Redhill. So what we got here is a screenshot from the Heathrow approach. So what we've got here is the squawk of the aircraft, and in normal circumstances it would be the flight number that would be displayed. Below it we've got the altitude, which in this case 5,400 feet. We've got the destination LL for London Heathrow, and we've got the selected altitude of the Mode S downlink of 5,000 feet. The BAT advisory shows a two-tone yellow pulse in the altitude field on the ATC label, which we've got down below here. The Mode S data window shows the actual barometric pressure setting being downlinked from the aircraft, which in this case is 1013 hectopascal. So we see the yellow highlight on the altitude field. The controller response is not mandated, but it is encouraged. The controller is encouraged to challenge, not to state the observed incorrect QNH setting, ask the crew to check the QNH setting, ask the crew to report their QNH setting. The UK CAA and NAT state that when ATC pass a reminder of the QNH, it is expected that altimeter settings will be checked. None of us likes to think that we'll be the ones to be involved in an occurrence. However, when those holes in the Swiss cheese slices start lining up, we can inadvertently be the ones to be involved. I'll leave these safety notices from IFALPA, EASA and the UK CAA here so that you can pause and read. The links to all the material utilised in this video are detailed in the comment section below. I hope you liked the video. Please like and subscribe. And if you have any comments you want to make, leave them in the comments on YouTube, or you can leave them on phone or WhatsApp, international 353 89 44 14 102, email irishskiespod@gmail.com, and we're on YouTube at Irish Skies Pod.
Flight level 90,